Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves can free our minds.
Welcome to Land of the Giants, the show where Christina and I discuss books we like,
Treacherous
or I
authors.
should say, books we're interested in, not necessarily like.
Very good.
Um, and today we are going to talk about Juliet, the the book by the Marquis de Sade, which most closely resembles a novel.
Yeah.
Um, and well, we do ladies first on this show, so you may begin.
Thank you very much. I think I titled this live stream, well, I put in the description that we're continuing to discuss treacherous authors because I really like your idea of treacherous thinkers, treacherous ideas, and kind of unpacking um, the the notion that there are certain authors that really require you to think, that present you with systems that are either deeply seductive or deeply repulsive or deeply problematic. So I wanted to share that when we first talked about discussing de Sade's work and Juliet in particular, I found myself suddenly thinking of the existentialist French thinkers, Camus and Sartre. And that was an interesting connection for me because I really read most of my Sade, a while ago in college. I refreshed for our chat. Um, but I think one of the most interesting things about Sade's work is that because the pornography, because the violence, because all of the kinds of explicit discussions of power are so sexualized, it can be really difficult for readers to get into and behind some of the more challenging and possibly kind of long lasting things that Sade is trying to talk about, which I think are like the existentialists.
Oh, well, that's great because that leads into just what I wanted to start talking about, and that is the word sadism, which was coined by Richard von Krafft-Ebing for his book Psychopathia Sexualis, most of which wouldn't be considered psychopathia today, would just be considered normal sexuality. Um, but he coined the word sadism to talk about some kinds of things in his book.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how people use the word today. And this really trivializes the Marquis de Sade for two reasons. And the first one is when you start to read a Marquis de Sade book and you think of the word sadism, you're not prepared for the level of shit play that you're going to find in the book.
Yeah,
So,
it doesn't come with scatological warning, right? It's
right.
especially appropriate for British and German viewers. But yes.
So first, you could have just as easily used the word sadism to refer to shit play
Yeah.
as opposed to whips and chains like we use it today. You could just as easily have talked about shit play as sadism. And second, the most interesting part of the Marquis de Sade's ideas are not let me say that he definitely wrote the greatest sex scenes that have ever been penned. But what's really interesting about him is his ideas on society and on government and religion, and well, just the way that society is put together in his world is very interesting. And maybe you want to continue from that.
So I definitely agree with you. I think that your point about, yeah, one is not prepared for the scatological for sure. And I think that what's interesting there is that it indicates one of those kind of sub meanings of sadism, which has to do with humiliation as opposed to the, I think, working definitions, which are, pleasure at someone else's pain, and therefore, heavy duty focus on all of the instruments and ways of inflicting physical pain. I think Sade definitely very quickly gets the reader into all of the elements that have to do with power and humiliation, okay, as opposed to power and pain, or power in the power is expressed as a domain over another person's physical self. All the scatology definitely reinforces the idea of humiliation and status and power, which lead into the things that he then talks at length, somewhat incoherently, sometimes really in a clear way. Right? In terms
Yes.
of, he's a little bit like Rand. He needed an editor, and then you definitely see someone working something out for themselves on the page. But this idea of humiliation, power, and status in the domain of the church, in the domain of society, and how that should then be expressed, given that I think it's also really key to remember that he is a revolutionary figure. He is absolutely of the period of the French Revolution. And so his writings are also going to reflect his society, right? We have to a little bit kind of divorce them from the amazing biography of the man and put them into the context of the time. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is Napoleon went out of his way to ban Sade's works. And I don't think that's because they're sort of uber rococo pornographic. I think it's because of the subversive position that he takes consistently towards not only the church, but precisely the society that wants to say that it isn't the church. He sees them exactly in the same terms.
So, okay, so I totally agree with what you said, and let me first say Sade is very similar to our previous author, Ayn Rand. Now, obviously, they are both working out philosophies that are based on um, selfishness, and they have similar writing styles, and they also have very strong, alluring personalities. And of course, I don't think Ayn Rand is for mass murder, and I don't think it's reasonable to take her philosophy in that direction. So I'm not trying to make that kind of comparison, but to me they seem like pretty similar personalities in a general kind of way. Uh, and Sade is, of course, what we would call a psychopath today. And Ayn Rand is not a psychopath, although she clearly had some personality problems. But they both have strong, alluring personalities. But I also wanted to make the comparison between Sade and another author that I love, Rabelais, because Rabelais likes shit a lot too, and you could well imagine some idiot trying to ban Rabelais based on all of the shit jokes, similar to how somebody might want to ban Sade because of the shit and the pornography without understanding anything about the uh, the deeper meaning of the stories without.
I think that's fantastic, because one of the things I want to say is, look, it's very likely that Sade read Rabelais, right? Like, think about what Sade is reading, what is available to him, and certainly in terms of some of the really successful satires, as you pointed out, about Rabelais. And it also makes me think about the fact that, look, human beings or human society's organization to their sanitary setup, right, is a marker of civilization, no? And it's an interesting kind of comment that both in Rabelais and in Sade, the function of shit and the characters' interaction with it, or their disdain from it, or how far they've been forced to move from being sort of detached from their own shit to being sort of right up in their own shit. I mean, come on, as I speak about it, right, it's clear that there's a lot of metaphorical energy in there, where shit is also functioning as kind of some kind of social commentary, right? I think the other thing I want to say is, apropos of Rand, yeah, I mean, Sade himself, as an individual person, we discuss his biography, to what extent he personally was a psychopath, or to what extent he personally was quote unquote insane, which is always a socially constructed.
Well, I don't think insane means anything. Yeah. Oh, so
Right, right.
I'm agreeing
Always
with
sort
what
of
you just
socially
said. Yeah.
constructed. I wanted to say, Ayn Rand didn't believe in um, the thing she has her character Tui say, right? And I think we also need to be careful to differentiate between what Sade's literary figures promote and what he himself did or was doing. And the fact that he had such a um, salacious and highly sexualized and highly unorthodox personal life, right? As far as I know, he himself was not out mass murdering. So I think there's an important point here where Sade as a person, as a biography, has become so closely identified with elements of his work as to be one and the same. And I think Rand has suffered from the same thing. And then I guess the last point to make is, yeah, I think they are both deeply interested in power, right? They're both deeply interested in the boundaries of individual power. And I think that the use that Sade makes of murder specifically, it always struck me as a rhetorical device, right? It always struck me as a very kind of conscious, it was one place where the kind of eroticism always slipped from the point of view of I didn't believe the author found that erotic. I believed that the author was absolutely moving into the shock value, the confrontational value, the push you to the point where your moral system had to break down. Because if you had carried any kind of erotic energy into those scenes, if you, the reader, had been stimulated in any way, Sade's sort of continual presentation of murder as an eroticized event is really trying to destabilize, I think, the reader.
Okay. Well, I think that well, so first of all, yeah, clearly Sade did not do the kinds of things that he has his characters do to the same scale. But I think that he is a psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, based on the psychology of the characters in the novel, because I would say that he shows very little. So okay, well, let me talk about a little about the novels. So in the de Sade's world, um, the leaders are all psychopaths, and that's kind of what I like about it, because that's kind of how I think about our world. I don't think it's quite as stark as imagines it, but he always has anybody who's like high up, who's like a priest or a government minister. They're always a psychopath, and they're always just like, yeah, the point of life is to enjoy myself as much as possible, and murder is the greatest pleasure. So and this is kind of his world, and it consists of predators and prey, and prey are the people who believe the religion, or who follow the social religion, and who believe that they need to be nice to other people, and they need to sacrifice themselves, and that it is worthy not to take revenge on your predators, kind of like how Jesus says to turn the other cheek. The people who do that are the prey in de Sade's world. So first of all, I would say that he doesn't really have a lot of insight into why somebody would really follow a religion. To me, like, he has these scenes where somebody uh, is some powerful person starts talking to the Juliet, the main character in the book Juliet, and he says like obviously the point of religion is to mind control people so that you can be the predator on them. And Juliet is like, oh wow, now that you say that, like, obviously, it's like she doesn't take any convincing. She just kind of like wakes up, and she's like wow, like, I want to be a predator.
Right, but I think so. I'm just interrupting for 2 points because there's two things, right? I was kind of smiling over here because when I read Sade, and still now I think that he was making social commentary. It was like a reporter on his times. I mean, I read Sade's text almost like a historical document that is describing to me exactly how society did function and did exist um, in the 18th century in France. So it's interesting to listen to you talk because I realized that I hadn't ever really considered it as an entirely kind of fictive or imaginary world. My sense was always that yes, the society out of which he was writing was absolutely entirely peopled with psychopaths, predators, and prey. And that the whole experience that Juliet displays of like somebody coming along and going, well, duh, this is a system it's designed to exploit. There's the weak and the eaten. And she's like, is kind of like the French Enlightenment. I mean, it's a little bit what Voltaire starts. And by the time you get to Sade, it's like, come on, guys, this whole system is rife with corruption and predatory behavior, and none of the things that are presented to you as sources of good and virtue are in fact sources of good and virtue. They're just sources of exploitation. Yeah, and therefore let's cut off the heads of a lot of people. I mean, it's important to also remember that like Sade's sort of relationship with murder as the highest good is in a society in which that is actually being played out by people whose personal lives could not be more spotless. I mean, Robespierre couldn't be a more clear counterpoint to Sade in terms of how he conducted his own sexuality or his own domestic life. And there's absolute justified mass murder. Right?
Yeah, well, okay. Well, to me, Desade's world is a lot like our world today.
Today. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
Except that Sade does not Sade doesn't understand the psychology of somebody who is living in the illusion very well.
I agree.
So like he has another book, Justine, that is about somebody. So Juliet is the person who becomes the predator, and she's a natural predator. And the novel Juliet is kind of about how she learns to be a predator.
Exactly.
And he wrote another book called Justine, which is about her sister, and Justine never learns to be a predator, and Justine keeps following the selfless morality.
Right,
and
the path of the prey. The path of prey.
Yeah, right. She is the prey. And to me, like, Juliet is so much more of an interesting character that like you would not I don't know why you would want like Justine is a much duller book.
Right, but I think it's worth, I think, you know, if when we're going to get serious about if somebody wanted to go and kind of do Sade for themselves and never read it, definitely you want to start with Justine, partly because he started with Justine and Juliet grows out of Justine.
Yeah.
And it's precisely that you can trace the development of Sade working out, you know, in the least confrontational way. Think about Mapplethorpe's pictures of flowers compared to Mapplethorpe's pictures of black dick, right? You move along and it's kind of confrontational, put stuff to you. And I think, right? Really,
honestly, I would just say just read Justine or just read Juliet. Like that's a 12,000 or 1,200 page novel. So
okay, so yeah, so I read fast and stuff. I mean, but even if one were just going to go to Wikipedia and, you know, start looking around to give yourself a general orientation or whatever it is, I think the idea that, you know, to a certain extent, I'm just thinking in Rand's book, you know, you see the same kinds of dynamics where the power of the interesting character, you know, almost derives from thinking about the really dull characters. No?
Yeah. So, well, just real quick. So my second reason that I think Sade really was a psychopath is the stuff that he was in jail for. I mean, it sounds like the kind of thing a psychopath would do. Like, not all of it, but I just looked him up on Wikipedia, and it says that he lured in a prostitute and he tied her up and whipped her, and he made various incisions on her body. And this was not like a consensual BDSM scene. He
How do
lured her
we know that,
in.
though? How do we know that, though? Right?
Right.
That
Okay. So I'm saying you could say that these are charges that were made up to discredit him.
no,
So
not so much that, but more like I've in my law in my I've been doing this online law course thing, and
well,
so one of the interesting things is that still today in the British high courts, a person cannot consent to something that qualifies as assault. So there are what are considered. I'm gonna just go with within liberal Western culture now, there are all kinds of private sexualized practices that if you consent to, then you're good to go and the state and people have nothing to say about it. However, that's still not the case within our legal framework. So we don't, I personally don't trust enough the interpretation of the events, either in terms of how they were framed then or how they might be framed now. So I personally am not a big fan of inflicting pain on other people or think that I would like to have pain inflicted on me. I think pain is, again, an individually constructed experience, but there are definitely acts that the community, in the form of the state, in the form of the law, has decided qualifies as assault. So it's an interesting place we still live today where you still can't give consent to assault. But what
okay,
happens
okay.
after
Well, yeah.
you
Well, that
break
makes
it
sense.
off?
So maybe he was not such a psychopath as he appears. But
That we've decided are okay are actually still psychopathic. I think it's that clearly this man was walking along all kinds of social convention boundaries that he would still be walking along today. Anybody in the lifestyle today who is walking along those boundaries is still um, walking an edge where we haven't really decided whether or not we think it's psychopathic or not. And that's partly because I think we're still figuring out what consent actually means.
yeah.
That's just my take on the terms, right?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, well, now I want to give like a sense of the novel.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going. So, so I said earlier, Juliet is the book that de Sade wrote that most closely resembles a novel, and that is because it has a main character who progresses through the novel, and that's Juliet, and she grows as a person as the events of the novel go on, but it's not very tightly structured. It's episodic, and it's very long. It's 1,200 pages, and it is not an easy read.
Not at all. Not at all.
It is.
And I think as challenging the pornographic scenes are, they are nothing compared to the rants against the anti-clerical church rants. I
Right.
mean,
So the book kind of alternates between like 50-page uh, pornography scenes and 50-page philosophical rants. And then
exactly.
there are a few events kind of in between where stuff happens.
Yeah, and characters move from point A to point B, and you kind of get a background change. You know, it's a little bit like a play, right? And there's
Yes.
not a lot of shift in the scenery.
You do have to be kind of a masochist to get through the book.
Maybe that's what we should call the series, or like masochistic texts, right? Just to get through. Um,
Uh, well, I don't know because there's some books that I really enjoyed that I want us to talk
totally,
about, but
totally. I mean,
definitely.
it's interesting. Like talking to you about it now makes me think about how things would have been had somebody been reading those rants out loud, right? Because as I just know, I mean, I have this visual memory precisely. You know, the text itself is such a physical event. It's 1,200 pages, you know, and the experience of just one of my favorite authors, Jean Reese, talks about the effect of the words on the page, just all these little black letters marching and marching and marching across the page. So there is this kind of unrelenting torrent. And I wonder what it would be like if it were spoken, because it might come across in that kind of sort of, I don't know, deeply evangelical religious sort of manner. I wonder if the anti-clerical rant is actually, can't help itself but be modeled on what might be a sermon, which,
Oh, no, absolutely. That makes so much sense. And to me, there's so much similarity between Desade's rants and John Galt's speech in
oh my
Atlas
God,
Shrugged,
right?
because like they are not like logical sequences of arguments. They are just like crazy like just all over the place, just rants. Like
They make me think
it's
of
like
they make me think of some of those like really geometric Kandinsky paintings where you have kind of lots of discrete geometrical shapes, and then you have all kinds of like funky lines that try to connect. I mean, it's kind of like a weird mind map for a paper. But yeah,
yeah.
that I think is what's happening.
They are like completely disorganized, and so the basically what happens to Juliet is there's 6 sections, and each one is like a different part of her life.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought you were shaking your head there.
Oh no, only that I have children who have come into the room.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So um, and in each one, Juliet meets one or more powerful predators
Hmm.
who impart their wisdom to her, and she learns to be more evil. And I think that there is a big comparison between de Sade and Rousseau here, because
Yes.
Juliet is a lot like Emile in that she's not very spontaneous,
Right.
and she kind of only does new things when the powerful predator uh, teaches her. Uh,
Right. So it's interesting that she's again, we're back to talking about the sort of two-dimensionality of characters. So I think in Desade's work, for sure, the characters that in some ways are the most fleshed out are exactly the predators. They're the teachers,
exactly, yeah.
and that's who he's kind of most interested in. And it's fascinating because what you're saying, I'm really stimulated by what you're saying, to draw some parallels to our modern world and to think about how this parable might actually play out. Like, what if you took a representative of an innocent, and I don't know, had her work 2 years at Goldman Sachs, and then had her work 3 years at McKinsey, and then
Oh
had
my
her go to the UK
god.
for a couple of years. And you could Bret Easton Ellis it, you could American Psychopath it, and you've got a kind of modern day version of Desaad, no?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think one of the things that it leads us back to is both of us had a response, which is that, wow, this guy is really trying to talk about stuff that's far more complex than what is already some of the most complex pornography ever produced, right? His social.
Oh yeah, let's briefly talk about that too, because if you try to imagine any of the sex scenes that
Oh, I think
Desaad describes.
dude, I mean, his works gave more employment to engravers in the 19th century than just about any other text,
they
right?
they they defy geometry. Like you're
They make
just,
me think,
what is going on? Like it'll take
uh,
like there's like 5 or 6 people, and they're like all connected to each other in a way where you think about it and you're like, what? How flexible are these people?
right, exactly. And so that's right. I mean, it's like an Escher painting, right? You've got
Yes. It's
pornographic Escher
Yeah,
painting.
it's like there's some sort of non-Euclidean geometry
Yeah,
going on here, where one half of a person comes back on the other side, and that's the only way to fit them
and they're
together.
very much, they're kind of like Hieronymus Bosch paintings, right? They're sort of mass. But I think the other thing, what you're saying makes me realize also that, like, look, if you think about it, right? For sure, I think there's no question that Desaad was in some kind of autoerotic state when he started to write that. I challenge anybody to write a pornographic scene and not become aroused themselves at some point while they're creating it. And the thing that's interesting is that over and over again, you can see him losing precisely any kind of like reality check with like, where does the body go, and legs, and the hips twist around this way, and what's gravity. And so, you know, you can kind of, you're almost getting a commentary on what it actually means to disappear into one's own kind of erotic state, and speculate on maybe the command of the writing is the point at which it's actually moving from reality, like you really can get 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 people doing, into like pure on fantasy, where you're not even really worrying about where the chair is, or where did the sword come from, or, you know.
So yeah, so I'm just going to do a couple of quick highlights here, because there's a part about maybe a third of the way in that I thought was great, where somebody says to Juliet, "You can just murder anybody you want for fun," and she's like, "Wow, like I never thought of that."
Yeah, but again, back to my kind of like, welcome to your internship with Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah. And so she's like, I gotta try this. And she just goes out with a pistol and she finds some homeless man and just blows his brains out. And I remember in the novel, she just, like, he describes it, it was like, it was the most amazing thing ever.
Right. And, you know, it's making me realize maybe it is the case that Albert Camus did read de Sade, right? Like, because that's exactly the thing that The Stranger is trying to get to. Like, here's this guy who just randomly went out and murdered someone. And for the whole book, you don't know why. You never know why. You know, and that it's and he doesn't care. And it's a whole meditation on, you know, some of the ways in which, you know, the exercise of power for simply the pleasure of the exercise of power is an essential kind of human experience, right? That there is this kind of duh factor to what the existentialists are trying to point out. And I think what de Sade is trying to point out, he really is inviting you to speculate on, wouldn't you too like to know what it's like to be able to just go out and murder anybody?
Yeah.
And, you know, you reader, how truthful do you want to be? It's the same thing as pornography, which goes, hi, reader, do you want to be truthful with yourself about what is and is not arousing to you? And now you have this knowledge. What are you going to do with it?
Oh, okay. Well, let me just mention The Shining really quick, because I want to talk about Stephen King eventually. But yeah, I think that that's the real horror of The Shining, is that you want to murder your family.
Exactly. And that's why I think they're treacherous books, because not only do they ask you to think for yourself, but they ask you to think about yourself, right?
Yeah.
And
so my next highlight from Juliet is Juliet and her friend, I don't remember who, but they get trapped in a big house with this very powerful predator, and they realize that all of the furniture in the house is alive, and it is like they're like people who have been enslaved, and they have been disguised to look like furniture, but he starts like ordering the table to move around, and it does what he says.
it's superb, right? It's superb. And you wonder, yeah, I mean, it brings to mind a lot of different things, right? And one can go like super abstract intellectual and say, well, look, here he's talking about, you know, the very mechanisms of society being made out of slave labor, right? Or you can just think, wow, the guy ate some wrong mushrooms, you know. But it is it's striking. It's striking in an Alice in Wonderland way. It's got a lot of resonances. I mean, I think the truth is that more, and I've never really reflected on this, but it must be that more authors have read de Sade and not necessarily ever talked about it than we might ever suspect, because I think his influence probably runs deeper than might appear from like what we kind of all culturally sort of generally know about him.
Yeah. Well, I remember in college. Sorry, I have no idea what you were trying to say.
I just said I have to wrap it up pretty soon. I'm getting I must go bowling messages through the door, which is kind of distressing. But
okay. Well, I got through almost everything in my notes. So let me quick say, I think there's also a comparison between de Sade and Les Miserables. I think that it's Juliet is kind of like the inverse Les Miserables book.
I think that's probably right. And again, we could make a whole list of people who probably read de Sade and would never have admitted it, and Victor Hugo is for sure one of them.
So, well, Victor Hugo is another treacherous author because he could have been a cult leader if he had really put his mind to it. And Les Miserables is kind of like a cult book.
Yes, and now a cult musical. I mean,
Yeah.
right?
And real quick, my last highlight is there's a scene near the end where they create a big room that's kind of like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where there's like spikes on the ceiling and the room comes down and crushes people. And the predators, the main characters, are all sitting watching while masturbating.
Right. Totally, right? And isn't, I mean, oh my God. Oh my God, I hadn't even thought. And you're making me think of Star Wars, right? Like you're making me think of like the garbage squisher and the Indiana Jones. And so what? We think Lucas read him as well. It's like, huh. And then also on a serious note, right? I mean, it's not that long since, Europeans had been really discovering South America and Mexico and, taking on board that they were encountering, cannibalistic rituals and so on. So, and there had been speculation, Montaigne and the French revolutionaries, a lot of speculation or pointing out that, the central Christian ritual is effectively cannibalistic. Here, eat my body and drink my blood, right? So the whole kind of amalgamation of ritual, death, sexuality, power, and I suppose just the idea that the most aphrodisiacal experience a person can have is the exercise of power.
Well, let's end it there.
I shall now go be a powerful bowler and not totally ruin my elbow or my reputation. But
okay, well, thanks a lot. Great show. Thanks for joining us. And see you next time.
Bye. On the other side.
Bye.
Bye.